It's a bluegrass battle to see whether Kentucky or Louisville hits the reset button better this offseason. Andy Patton, which roster would you rather have?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. We're your hosts, Andy Patton, and I'm Isaac Shade, and you're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. Thanks for making us your first listen or watch, and we want to remind you that you can grab every episode ad-free on Amazon Music. We want to send a special shout out to all of you everydayers out there, as well as all the members of the Locked On College Basketball Discord. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job right now at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Andy, going to be a fun Monday show today as you're listening to this on Monday, May 20th. It is 9 days, Andy, until the NBA draft withdrawal deadline. So we will know for sure in 9 days what players are back in college and which ones are not. It's like finally, like when we hit that, I'm starting to feel good about where rosters are. Coming up, though, on the show today, we know where AJ Hoggard is now headed. It's an interesting landing spot, Andy. We'll talk about that. Dillon Mitchell stays in the Big 12, and several mid-major programs have done some work this offseason. Andy recently wrote about it, and he wants to share his answers with you. But first, Mr. Patton, yet another commitment to one of the preeminent schools in the Bluegrass state. Over the weekend, Noah Waterman commits to Louisville on Saturday. And man, I love that we're getting some of Mark Pope's former players committing to Kentucky's rival Louisville. It makes this whole thing all the more interesting. But Andy, with both of these schools hitting the reset button, here in a second, we're going to have a conversation about with where the rosters are now, with where they could be when things are finalized. Which roster do we think is in a better spot? So we're going to have that conversation. Let's talk some about Noah Waterman's commitment to Louisville first, though.
Yeah, it's funny, like you said, the fact that as soon as Mark Pope took the job at Kentucky, there was an expectation that at least a handful of players from BYU would consider or potentially end up in Kentucky, and they did. They just didn't end up at Kentucky. They ended up at Louisville. Just a unique thing that happened there. I thought Ali Khalifa was a phenomenal fit for Mark Pope's offense as a distributing big. He averaged 4 assists per game in like 16 minutes, but instead he ends up at Louisville. And Noah Waterman, another big who I thought was kind of the right fit. I mean, he played well, obviously, for Mark Pope last year. A stretch big, kind of seemed like to fit that high-octane three-point shooting offense that Mark Pope likes to run. But he ends up going to Louisville as well. And again, Pat Kelsey runs an offense that revolves a lot around bigs who can space the floor, and they're a very high-octane, 90-plus point per game style offense. So these guys are logical fits for both programs. And for BYU, they do get Colin Chandler, or for Kentucky, they do get Colin Chandler, who is a commit to BYU, who's now at Kentucky, and Kentucky has their eyeballs on Jackson Robinson, who we'll talk about momentarily, probably the best player for BYU last year, who could end up a Wildcat if he doesn't stay in the NBA draft process. But I like this fit for Louisville. They really needed to beef up their front court. They'd made a lot of quality additions in the backcourt. Chucky Hepburn is, I think, a huge transfer portal addition for them out of Wisconsin. There's a couple other guards from the former Pac-12, Corin Johnson, Javon Hadley, who I really like as well. But this team needed to beef up the front court in a matter of a week or so. They add Waterman from BYU. They add Kason Pryor, who was another stretch big who played very well last year for Abdur-Rahim at South Florida. They add an incoming freshman coming in as well, who's going to be able to play in the front court, Kanai Ruths. So we're looking at, I think, a Louisville roster at this point that looks pretty complete. I think there's maybe still an addition to be made, but 11 transfers for Pat Kelsey. This man was very, very busy over the transfer portal. And of course, as he had to be. His entire roster left. If you're a Louisville fan, I don't think you feel anything but joy about having a brand new roster in that program after what happened the last 2 years under Kenny Payne. I'm really curious how these pieces will fit together, frankly, at both of these programs.
Sure.
And I think these are two very good coaches who are going to be capable of making this kind of puzzle fit together in a way that's going to lead to success. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun to see these two teams get a chance to play each other this year, of course, and kind of how these two respective rebuilds go in the next couple of years.
Yeah, Andy, I love your point about the similarities of at least the offensive stylings of both of these coaches. I cannot wait for when they play this year, because, it could very well be a game in the 90s, as you were alluding to, because there is a lot of talent on both rosters. It's just going to ultimately be how it all fits together. Yeah, it's wild how, probably about this time last week, we were like, man, Louisville's got a lot of front court work left to do. And as you said, boom, 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 3 in a week. And it's like, okay, looking great now. But while they do have the 11 transfers and the 1 incoming freshman in Ruth, there's 1 scholarship available. And in this day and age, Andy, we've been saying a lot that coaches typically probably aren't going to use all 13 of their available scholarships. But folks, for your awareness, redshirt players, their scholarships do count against that scholarship quota. So that means that both Ali Khalifa, who won't be playing this year, and then Kobe Rogers, one of the Charleston trio that came with Pat Kelsey, suffered that left leg injury against Alabama in the NCAA tournament and will be redshirting this year as well. So while they've used 12 of their scholarships, Andy, only 10 of those will be playing this year. So I think, and I think you're probably of the mind as well, that Louisville will go ahead and use all 13 scholarships. Our great Locked On Louisville host, Dalton Pence, has suggested that maybe Frank Anselm from University of Georgia with 1 year of eligibility left would be a good fit for that. A 6'10 center, probably wouldn't play a ton, but would be another good front court depth piece. So we'll look to see what happens with that. As for Kentucky, they have 8 transfers coming in, so not quite as many as Louisville, and 3 incoming freshmen, including Colin Chandler coming in that you had talked about earlier, Andy. And so right now, Kentucky has 2 scholarships available. The 2 names that have been most associated with Kentucky as possibilities right now are Jackson Robinson, you talked about, and then Chaz Lanier from North Florida. We're still waiting to see what both of these guys are going to do. Andy, are you of the mind that Kentucky, I know we talked some about Kentucky's roster on Friday. We didn't really project ahead, though, to how they might use those last 2 scholarships. Do you think they would look to get both of those guys, use 1 scholarship? What's your opinion on how Kentucky finishes things here?
I certainly think they'd love to add both if they could. I don't know how realistic that will be. I mean, I don't know exactly what their NIL budget is, but certainly if one of these players were to commit, I think the other one might have a hard time seeing an obvious fit for playing time at Kentucky. Like if Jackson Robinson commits, I think he starts kind of at that 3 spot alongside Brea and Creasa, with the front court of probably Andrew Carr and Brandon Garrison, maybe Amari Williams mixes in there as well, but you still got Lamont Butler coming off the bench. You'd have Otega Owe in that case coming off the bench as well. So I think there's absolutely room for one more. And I think we talked on Friday's show about them kind of needing like a go-to scoring option. And I think Lanier or Robinson could kind of fill that role for this team and sort of be that critical final piece for this team. But I don't know if they get both. And if they only get one, I'm not sure if they fill that final spot or not. They might be able to find like a decommit freshman like they did with Trent Noah, who was committed to South Carolina and flipped to Kentucky. I could see them using that as a way to fill that final roster spot. But I think there's one more big addition coming for Kentucky. And I think it's very likely going to be one of either Robinson or Lanier, because I don't think both are going to stay in the draft process. In fact, I'm not sure either is going to stay in the draft process. And I think one of them will end up in Lexington next season.
And how funny would it be if, because I know it seems like Lanier is probably Kentucky or Tennessee, but BYU's in the mix for that. So how funny would that be if he went back to BYU? Anyway, so Andy, ultimately, let's answer our question here. Which of these teams, both where they're at right now and where you think they'll end up roster-wise, would you rather have?
I'm going to say Kentucky, but I do think it's closer than a lot of people might think. I really like what Pat Kelsey and Louisville have done. I think the front court, the recent additions have helped a lot, but they don't have a lot of like real size in the front court. Like Waterman and Pryor are more stretch fours. They're not super like low post physical threats. Right. James Scott is more like that, but he's coming from Charleston. I don't know how that necessarily adapts to the ACC. So I'm a little bit more concerned about the front court for Louisville than I am with Kentucky. And that's kind of one of the key differences. But I really like Javon Hadley and Corin Johnson, and Chucky Hepburn is a great guard room. And we haven't even mentioned Terrence Edwards Jr., who was phenomenal scorer for James Madison last year. There's a real chance he's the leading scorer for this Louisville team next year. So I really like what Pat Kelsey has done, but I think there's enough high major talent that has come to Kentucky. Kirk Kriisa was very good last year. Lamont Butler is probably going to come off the bench, and he's a phenomenal player to have coming off the bench. So I'm going to lean Kentucky, but I will say that I think it's a lot closer than the majority of people might believe.
Particularly if Kentucky does, in fact, get Jackson Robinson or Chaz Lanier. I mean, and Andy, that's the exact place I would go. I think, and I need to spend more time on this, but I think Louisville might actually be a more talented roster, but the way the Kentucky pieces fit, I think makes it a better team right now. Is that a fair way to put that?
I think so too. And I think it does, like, coaching is a factor as well, but I like both these coaches. Like, there's not one coach here that I think is obviously better than the other. Obviously Pope has done it at a higher level, but again, only for one season when they were in the Big 12. Prior to that, they were in the WCC, and the last year in the conference, they finished 5th in the WCC. So I think that the coaching is going to play a role, but I do think that it's kind of up in the air which one of these two coaches is going to adapt better to their new situation.
Ultimately, this is going to be great for college basketball. It's going to be great for the state of Kentucky when both of these programs are good. Really excited to see what both Coach Pope and Coach Kelsey bring to the table this year.
Well, Isaac, Texas may be headed to the SEC, but Dillon Mitchell is not. He is staying in the Big 12 after committing to Cincinnati. What does that mean for Wes Miller and the Bearcats? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. Because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team. They do it faster and for free. And LinkedIn isn't just another generic job board. They help you hire professionals you cannot find anywhere else, and even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, folks, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Plus, LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make this process even easier. They just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process easier and quicker. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, guys, I got a couple transfer portal moves that we saw over the weekend, or in Dillon Mitchell's case on Friday afternoon, that we wanted to kind of cover here too.
Hang on, are you not counting Friday afternoon as the weekend, Andy?
That's a great point. That's a great point. That is absolutely the weekend. Come on, afternoon on Friday, at least on the West Coast, so everywhere. And maybe Hawaii. Maybe Hawaii is the only place that it wasn't the afternoon on Friday when Dillon Mitchell committed to Cincinnati. But
dude, I'm starting my weekend starts Thursday night. Friday just doesn't.
Regardless, two big-time transfer portal moves. Dillon Mitchell to Cincinnati, we'll talk about that. AJ Hoggard goes from Michigan State to Vanderbilt, joins Mark Byington, who's the new coach over there after coming over from James Madison. I will start with Dillon Mitchell. So Mitchell was a really high-profile freshman when he joined Texas, a guy a lot of people thought was going to be a one-and-done, 6'8", super versatile athletic forward. He spent the last 2 years with the Longhorns, and it's not that he was bad. He wasn't bad. He just he didn't quite develop into, didn't really show the requisite skills to be an NBA player. The outside shooting is frankly at this point non-existent. Unclear if it will ever be a part of Dillon Mitchell's game, and if it doesn't become one, then that kind of is going to curb his ability to be an NBA player. But he averaged about 10 points and 7.5 boards last year for the Longhorns. Explosive athlete, very good offensively and defensively, and he joins a Cincinnati roster that really in an era where you're not seeing, especially a program like Cincinnati, a good but not great Big 12 team, you're not expecting to see so many returnees. But Cincinnati's getting 6 of their top 8 scorers back, and now they add a player in Dillon Mitchell who clearly can be a very impactful player for this program. I think it's fair to be pretty darn excited about the direction of Cincinnati basketball right now for a team that hasn't made the NCAA tournament since the final year of Mick Cronin's tenure there. This is the team that's looking on the up and up after adding Mitchell.
Yeah, and Andy, that's the weird thing. As I was thinking about this conversation we were going to have, I was like, it's weird to me that Wes Miller, or Cincinnati under Wes Miller, has still not made the NCAA tournament. And
I was surprised when I learned that too.
Yeah, and it's, as I look at this, look, and I know the Big 12 makes a lot of good teams look silly and dumb, but this team, I think now, Andy, tell me if you feel differently, but we're going to have to continue to look at how all the rosters shape up. But this Cincinnati team really feels, especially with the addition of, yes, I know you and I and Dillon Mitchell combined have made 0 3-pointers ever in college basketball. But with all the explosive elite athleticism that he brings to, a Wes Miller club that likes to have that tough-minded defensive thing, it's like, boy, he's going to add a lot. This, to me, at this point, feels like a top 25 level team.
I think so too. It's a team that they lose Victor Locke and he transfers to Clemson. They lose John Newman. He's a senior guard who was a really good defensive kind of tough-nosed player for them. But other than that, they bring everybody back. And you bring everybody back. You replace Lock-in with a guy in Dillon Mitchell, who I think really fits the style of basketball that Cincinnati plays. We saw this team really kind of thrive down the stretch, I think, as they got their bearings in the Big 12. I know that Kansas was injured and not playing at full strength in that game in the Big 12 tournament, but Cincinnati stomped all over them. It was like a 20-point win. So what a way to carry some momentum going into the offseason. They bring in Connor Hickman, a guy who shot over 40% on 6 attempts per game from 3 last year at Bradley. They bring in Arrington Page, a tough defensive center from USC. They got some incoming freshmen who are ranked in the top 80 nationally. Like, this is a team to get excited about. And I think with Wes Miller, the continuity is huge. We've talked about continuity in college basketball always being vital. Mitchell seems like a player who fits into the system that Wes Miller runs. I think Hickman and Page are going to be quality fits as well. Like, I think it's very reasonable to be pretty optimistic, as optimistic as you can be about a team in the Big 12, that especially the new Big 12, where your top 5 are some combination of Kansas, Houston, Arizona, Baylor, and Iowa State, which are probably all top 10 teams in the country. Like, it's going to be really hard to break through in the Big 12, but Cincinnati's as equipped as anybody kind of in that middle tier in that conference. Well,
quickly, Andy, before we move on to AJ Hoggard, what about the Texas side of this as they slide out of the Big 12 into the SEC? Max Asmus is gone. Tyrese Hunter's gone. Dylan DeSue. I mean, this now means your 4 leading scorers are gone for Rodney Terry. Actually, thankfully, they're going to the SEC and not staying in that Big 12 because, good grief, I don't see how they would crack that top 5. The SEC, I don't think is going to be – I'm going to make this statement, and I haven't really processed it well enough. I don't think the SEC is going to be quite as – high end as it was last year, but still a very, very difficult conference. Coach Terry is going to have to do a really good job stepping into the SEC next year from a coaching standpoint.
Yeah, and I think you look at a team that's added well in the transfer portal in the backcourt. They added Tremont Mark from Arkansas. They added Jordan Pope from Oregon State, who's a really, really good player. Those 2 guys are phenomenal, but those guys kind of replace Asmus and Hunter. They added some Indiana State players, Julian Larry and Jason Kent. Those guys are good as well, but they haven't really replaced Mitchell. And Caden Shedrick comes back, and that helps in the front court as a kind of defensively more than anything, but he's not an offensive threat, and your other offensive threats are now in the backcourt. So I really think this team, in order to kind of feel more comfortable about how they're going to slot into an SEC, that I think you're right is a little bit, I don't want to say down yet, but like Arkansas's roster is hard to pin down. Kentucky, we just talked about them a little bit. Alabama's going to be great, but Tennessee loses Connect. Like, there's some reasons for a fair amount of skepticism, but for Texas, like, they need a 3-4 like high scoring wing. They need a Jameer Watkins. They need a Trevon Brazile. They need an Arthur Kaluma. Like if they can land somebody like that, and a lot of the players that they could target to fill that role are in the middle of the NBA draft process. So we'll see if they actually make an addition, pull somebody in there. But if they don't land anybody else there, I would be fairly concerned about the team's depth and really kind of where some of that scoring is coming from outside of Mark and Pope in the backcourt.
Man, I would love Jameer Watkins at Texas. That would be fun.
Really nice.
Right. Andy, AJ Hoggard is choosing his team over the weekend on Saturday afternoon. The options were quite a few SEC schools, Georgia, Florida, Vanderbilt, and a couple Big Ten schools.
Still weird.
I'm just going to keep laughing all summer long. USC and Washington, right? Andy, did you see Vandy coming on this thing, or did that take you by surprise?
You know, I'd heard that Florida was surprised to be on this list, as in, like, I don't think there had been a lot of contact between the two sides. So I kind of assumed it wasn't going to be Florida. And Washington added 2 guards in a span of like 3 days right before Hoggard committed. So I was like, well, it's probably not going to be Washington. But USC made sense to me. They've made a bunch of guard additions as well. But I thought Eric Musselman might want to bring in a veteran guy like Hoggard. I thought that made sense.
Georgia Eric Musselman always brings in 87 guards.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he's not he unless he's out of scholarships, he's going to be adding transfers until he absolutely cannot anymore. I thought that USC made sense. I thought Georgia made sense, and Vanderbilt kind of felt like the wild card. And I've said this on the show before, and I will say it again: if a school stands out on a player's top 5, it feels like that's the direction they're going. If they have 4 high majors and 1 mid major, figure out why the mid major's on there. And I know that's not the case here. I'm not calling Vanderbilt a mid major, but if you see a situation like that, sometimes that's what it is. And I'm not sure exactly what the sales pitch was here, but I don't hate the fit. I'm intrigued in part because this is now the 5th guard that Mark Byington has brought to Vanderbilt from the transfer portal. 5 guards have come in. All of them are coming from the mid-major level, except MJ Collins coming from Virginia Tech. They had Chris Mannon from Cornell, Grant Huffman from Davidson, Jason Edwards from North Texas. I think Hoggard's pretty clearly PG1. He's going to be the facilitator. He's going to be the on-ball lead guard, and I think he's more than capable of filling that role. But it was not exactly a school I would have projected when Hoggard first entered the portal, and I'm very curious how he adjusts to his 5th year of college basketball and his first year playing in an offense that was not set by Tom Izzo.
Speaking of Tom Izzo, let's go there, Andy, because I think probably we have a bigger Michigan State audience than Vanderbilt audience, if we're being honest. And the question becomes, what does this now mean for the Fightin' Sparties? And, you know, not only have they lost AJ Hoggard, but also Mady Sissoko. And Andy, I don't think it's the wildest thing for me to suggest that Michigan State might not be too terribly upset about losing either of these basketball players.
No, I think that's true. And I think Tom Izzo, without directly saying it, sort of said it. I think he had a quote where he said, AJ Hoggard's not going to play for us next year. And that was before Hoggard had entered the transfer portal. So I do think that this was kind of the expectation that was going to happen. And Tom Izzo, he doesn't like the transfer portal. He doesn't use it much. They've added a couple of players, but nobody who's really going to probably step into a super huge role for this team. And the players who are going to benefit from Hoggard not being in the mix next year were 2 guys who are already on the roster, Jeremy Fears and Trey Holloman. They're going to step up into bigger roles. Right. And then you have an incoming freshman, Jace Richardson. He's more of a combo guard, I think. I don't know how much he's going to be a pure point guard necessarily, but 4-star kid, 34th in the class of 2024. He's probably going to have a role right away. I think Fears and Holloman step into more of that kind of starting point guard type role for Michigan State. I don't think this is a huge loss. Hoggard's a good player. He's a polarizing player. He didn't perform as well as a senior as he did as a junior, and I think that frustrated a lot of Michigan State fans who also just endured a not very good season last year. But Hoggard still averaged 10 and 5. He shot a career high 34.7% from 3. He is capable of being a really good player on a team like Vanderbilt, but I'm curious what that transition looks like. Can he actually elevate Vanderbilt into being a better program than they were last year, or is he going to kind of put up empty stats for a team that's not going to do very well in the SEC? Because frankly, I think it's more likely to be the latter than the former. And that may be fine for Hoggard. It may be fine for Vanderbilt, but I don't know that he's really a needle mover in a big way for Vanderbilt or for the SEC.
Well, we will certainly find out the answer to that, along with Texas as they join that same conference. But Andy, a pair of last season's best mid-major programs are at it once again, pulling in some great transfer portal classes this offseason. Some classes, quite frankly, that will make some high major teams blush quite themselves. Who are they, and why do we think they're at the top of this thing? We'll talk about it in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. Heck, we had 2 Game 7s on Sunday in the NBA, Andy, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, player props, money lines, and so much more. We talked about Kentucky and Louisville earlier. Well, it's pretty clear which school in Kentucky the odds makers like better, with Kentucky at plus 4,500 odds to win the 2025 national championship, and Louisville is a little bit further down at plus 8,000. Maybe you love the Cards and you want to take those long odds. Be our guest. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Andy, you were writing an article over the weekend about mid-majors and which had done the best in the portal this offseason. And it's interesting because we have 2 kind of teams that were in a similar spot last year with some coaching names of repute that have both been at the high major level previously. And I think that might have something to do with this. But Andy, I'm just going to hand you the mic and let you take this away here. Who are your top 2 mid-major teams that have done work in the transfer portal this offseason?
I think you're absolutely right that the coaches make a difference here. We're talking McNeese State. Will Wade obviously been there for a couple of years now, turned this program into a 30-win team last year. They were a 12 seed in the NCAA tournament. And speaking of 12 seeds in the NCAA tournament, speaking of 12 seeds in the tournament who played WCC teams last year, weirdly enough, the other team here is Grand Canyon. Both were 12 seeds last year. Both were 30-win teams at the mid-major level. McNeese did not beat Gonzaga, but Grand Canyon did secure their first ever NCAA tournament win last year by beating St. Mary's. They actually held their own against Alabama until late in the second half.
That was a great game.
It was a great game. Tyon Grant Foster was one of my favorite players to watch last year. He's out of eligibility, part of the reason Grand Canyon hit the transfer portal hard this offseason. But 2 teams that are really doing a good job of capitalizing on that momentum. And this is a larger conversation that perhaps you can have another time, but the narrative is that mid-majors cannot succeed in the modern college basketball transfer portal era. And to an extent, this is true. I don't want to belittle this point and say, oh, everything's fine. Like, no, mid-major conferences by and large are getting gashed by the transfer portal, but there are teams that have found ways to succeed despite that. And McNeese and Grand Canyon, I think, are 2 that really stand out. And we'll start with McNeese. Looking at this class right here, I mean, really talented players coming not only from the high major level, but from mid majors as well. Sincere Parker, very, very good player from St. Louis. He transfers to Will Wade's team. Quadir Copeland comes over from Syracuse. Joe Charles from Louisiana Lafayette. Brandon Murray from Ole Miss. Bryant Selabang from Arizona State. And then Jerome Brewer from Texas A&M Commerce. That's the class right now. I really like the additions that Will Wade's team has made. I think this program is going to once again dominate the Southland Conference. And I think we're going to, as long as Will Wade stays there, this is going to be one of the premier mid-major programs in college basketball.
Man, Andy, it's so good. And I love, like, part of it too is it's not only having a coach with high major experience. So many of those names you just mentioned are coming off of playing at the high major level, and they're going to be able to just keep rolling. And I love to see it. Andy, what's happening in the biggest hole in our country?
Grand Canyon's only had 4 additions, but I really like who they are. The most recent one, which kind of prompted this conversation, was Glenn Taylor Jr. coming from St. John's. He'd started his career at Oregon State, transferred to St. John's, a small forward who is a versatile guy, didn't have huge production at St. John's, but was good there, was good for Rick Pitino. Now he comes over to Grand Canyon. I think he's going to step into a nice role right away. But to me, I'm really intrigued by Jacoby Coles coming from TCU. He's a really good player. I think he's a really good fit for what Bryce Drew likes to do with this Lopes program. I think he's going to be fantastic. They get Dennis Evans from Louisville, and I'm incredibly intrigued by this. Evans was a top 20, maybe top 15 prospect in the class of 2023, committed to Louisville early in the process. things didn't go well there because pretty much nobody who played for Kenny Payne had things go particularly well for them, but he's got multiple years of eligibility. He's a tough, big, physical center, can be a rim protector. I think he's going to, if he's healthy and gets the keys to the kingdom, I think he's going to dominate in the WAC. And then they add Makia Williams, transfer from UT Arlington, the name that is the least familiar here, but Makia Williams was the WAC Freshman of the Year last year. He was the best freshman in the entire conference last year. I think he's a great addition as well. So for Grand Canyon, they're losing some talent. Obviously, Grant Foster, we mentioned him. Javon Blackshear just finally got cleared to be eligible for another year and then immediately hit the portal. So that's a bummer loss for Bryce Rue and the Lopes. Yeah. But I think these two teams are going to be back in the 30-win conversation next year. And for Grand Canyon, I think could once again win the WAC, once again put themselves in the NCAA tournament. It's their final year in that conference before they join the WCC. And I think it's going to be a really good one for that team.
Yeah, Andy, and I think success breeds success here. And these teams did so well. Guys want to come be part of these programs, all the more so for GCU, as you said, as they're about to transition out of the WAC to the West Coast Conference. And so we'll see what goes on there. Andy, two other quick schools that you had mentioned are St. Louis and UC Santa Barbara. Obviously, Josh Schertz is coming over from Indiana State to St. Louis to the A10, brings Robbie Avila, our favorite Rec Specs dude, along with him. And so that's been a little bit more high profile. But Andy, and just a quick word, because I know we're short on time. Why does UC Santa Barbara make your list here?
They added effectively a starting 5 worth of transfers. Kenny Pato is the big man coming over from Wichita State. He averaged like 9 and 6 the last 2 years. Max Morrell from Stanford didn't play much, but has stretch 4 abilities. Colin Smith only played 7 games last year for Vanderbilt, but averaged about 7 points a game. Deuce Turner was one of the best scorers in the entire WCC last year at San Diego. Stefan Swenson comes over from Stetson, a guy who averaged, I think, like 14 and 6 assists. And Santa Barbara had a lot of good transfers the year before, and they went 5 and 13. So Joe Pasternak has proven he can get good players to transfer to UC Santa Barbara. Can he turn it into wins? I don't know. And as long as he keeps getting high-profile players, I think he's going to keep his job. But at some point, it has to turn into W's. So we'll see if that ends up being the situation for them in the Big West. But I'm intrigued by this class once again for the Gauchos.
Andy, yes, love it. Folks, if you have other mid-major schools that you're intrigued by that you think did a good job this offseason, we'd love to hear it from you in the comments or come find us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord.
Isaac, that's going to wrap it up for us today here on Locked On College Basketball. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Reminder to join us on the Locked On College Basketball Discord if you have not done so already. It is free to join. There's a link in the show notes on both the audio and video platforms. We will be back the rest of the week, keeping you up to date on which of those players are staying in the NBA draft process, who's coming back, some of the big name transfers yet to commit. We got all of that and more coming your way this week on Locked On College Hoops. Until then, though, apologies as always to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. And until Tuesday, peace.